The iron wheels hammered against the tracks with a rhythm that felt like a slow, heavy heartbeat. Hannah Reed pressed her forehead against the hot glass of the train window, watching the world transform before her eyes. For days, the landscape had shifted from the crowded, gray industrial mist of the east to the rolling green hills of the Midwest, and finally, to this vast, terrifying emptiness. The Texas Panhandle in the year 1878 was not a place that welcomed strangers. It was an ocean of red earth and dry grass, stretching out until it met a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Hannah was 23 years old, though she felt twice that age. Her hands, resting on the coarse fabric of her travel dress, were rough from years of handling needles and thread in the textile mills of Boston. Those hands had washed the bodies of her parents when the fever took them. Those hands had held her younger brother, Thomas, while the life bled out of him after the accident at the factory. Now, those hands held a one-way ticket to a place called Dusty Creek and a letter from a man she had never met. She was not looking for love. Romance was a luxury for women who did not have to worry about where their next meal came from. Hannah was a mail-order bride, a transaction made on paper. John Miller, a rancher, had written to the agency asking for a wife who was sturdy, God-fearing, and willing to work. In return, he promised protection, a roof that did not leak, and food on the table. He had called it a home. That was all Hannah wanted. A home where the air was not filled with cotton dust and the coughing of dying workers. The whistle of the locomotive shrieked, cutting through her thoughts. The train began to slow, the metal brakes grinding with a high-pitched squeal that set her teeth on edge. Hannah took a deep breath, smoothing the wrinkles in her skirt. She grabbed her small carpet bag. It contained everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, a Bible, a small sewing kit, and the packet of letters from John Miller. When Hannah stepped onto the wooden platform of the Dusty Creek station, the heat hit her like a physical blow. It was dry and dusty, smelling of sagebrush, horse manure, and heated iron. The town was small, a collection of wooden buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vastness of the prairie. There was a general store, a bank, a livery stable, and a large structure with swinging doors that she assumed was the saloon. Further out, on a rise overlooking the town, stood the wooden palisades of a military outpost, Fort Glory. People stopped what they were doing to watch the train. Men with sun-ravaged faces and wide-brimmed hats paused in their loading of crates. Soldiers in blue uniforms leaned on their rifles. They looked at Hannah not with welcome, but with a hard, assessing curiosity. To them, she was a soft thing from the east, a piece of china likely to crack in the heat. Watching from the shade of the station overhang was Major Henry Cartwright. He was a man of 40, with a spine as stiff as a ramrod and eyes the color of cold steel. As the commander of Fort Glory, he viewed this territory as a chessboard. The railroad was the queen, the cattle were the rooks, and the Comanche were the opposing pieces that needed to be swept off the board. He took a long draw from his cigar, his eyes narrowing as he observed the young woman stepping off the train. She was pale, too thin, but she stood straight. She looked lost. A woman without protection in this territory is a dangerous thing, the major thought, or a useful one. He knew who she must be. Miller had mentioned he was sending for a bride. The major flicked the ash from his cigar. He had his own plans for the valley, plans that involved the Railroad Commission and the removal of the savages who insisted on hunting buffalo where the tracks needed to go. A lone woman might be leveraged. He adjusted his uniform jacket and watched as she began to walk toward the town center. Hannah kept her chin up, ignoring the stares. She needed to find someone who could direct her to the Miller Ranch. She avoided the gaze of a group of rough-looking buffalo hunters who were spitting tobacco juice into the dust. She saw a sign swinging above a porch, "The Thirsty Steer." It looked like the only place where she might find information, even if a lady had no business walking into a saloon. She pushed through the doors. The interior was dim and smelled of stale beer and sweat. Conversations died down as she entered. A piano player in the corner stopped mid-melody. A stout woman with hair dyed a fierce shade of red was wiping down the bar. This was Maggie. the owner of the establishment, and, in many ways, the mother of the town. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she took in Hannah's dusty travel dress and the carpet bag. "Can I help you?" Miss Maggie asked, her voice raspy but not unkind. Hannah approached the bar, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am looking for Mr. John Miller. I am Hannah Reed. I am excited." The silence in the room deepened. It became heavy, suffocating. A few of the men at the card tables looked down at their drinks. Maggie stopped wiping the counter. She placed the rag down slowly. She looked at Hannah with a gaze that held a mixture of pity and weariness. "You are the bride," Maggie said softly. "The one from Boston." "Yes," Hannah said. "Is he here? Is he at the ranch?" Maggie sighed, a long, heavy exhalation. She came around the bar and took Hannah's arm, guiding her toward a small table in the corner, away from the prying ears of the men. "Sit down, child," Maggie said. Hannah remained standing. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, louder than the train wheels. "Where is he, honey?" Maggie said, looking her straight in the eye. "John Miller is dead." The world tilted. Hannah gripped the back of the chair to keep from falling. "Dead? It happened 3 weeks ago," Maggie explained gently. "There was a skirmish out near the canyon. Some say it was rustlers. Some say it was a hunting accident. He was buried on his land. Dead." The word echoed in Hannah's mind, stripping away every layer of hope she had built up over the long journey. The leaking roof in Boston seemed suddenly preferable to this abyss. But Hannah stammered. "But I am here. I know," Maggie said. "I am truly sorry." Hannah sat down then, her legs refusing to hold her. She felt numb. She had no money to go back. She had no family to return to. She was alone in a town that looked at her like a piece of meat, thousands of miles from anything familiar. Major Cartwright pushed through the saloon doors at that moment. He walked with the heavy stride of a man who owned the ground beneath his boots. He surveyed the room and walked straight to their table. "I heard the news," Cartwright said, removing his hat. "A tragedy about Miller. You must be Miss Reed." Hannah looked up at him. His face was sharp, clean-shaven except for a mustache, and entirely devoid of warmth despite his polite words. "I am Major Cartwright, from the fort," he continued. "If you need assistance, the Army can arrange for your temporary lodging until you can secure a return ticket." "I have no money for a return ticket," Hannah whispered, the humiliation burning her throat. The Major's eyes flickered. "Is that so? Well, the territory is a hard place for a destitute woman. Perhaps we can find a place for you at the Fort Laundress quarters." "Hard work, but it puts bread in your mouth." Maggie bristled. "She is not going to scrub soldiers' long johns. Henry, she can stay here. I need help in the kitchen." The Major looked at Maggie with cold amusement. "A saloon kitchen? Hardly a fitting place for a decent woman, but the choice is hers." He turned back to Hannah. "Think about it, Miss Reed. The frontier is no place for the weak. You will need protection." He placed his hat back on his head and walked out. Hannah watched him go, feeling a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. There was something predatory in the way he looked at her, like a hawk circling a field mouse. "I need some air," Hannah said, her voice trembling. She stood up and walked out the back door of the saloon, stepping onto a small wooden porch that overlooked the vast expanse of the prairie to the west. The sun was beginning to dip lower, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. And then she saw them, far out on the horizon, silhouetted against the burning sun. A line of riders moved along the ridge. They were not soldiers. They did not slouch in their saddles like the cowboys. They sat erect, moving with a fluid grace that made them look like extensions of their horses. Feathers fluttered from their lances and hair, catching the dying light. "Comanche," a voice said behind her. Hannah jumped. It was Maggie, holding a glass of water. "They are watching," Maggie said, handing her the glass. "Always watching. The Major wants them gone. Says they are nothing but savages standing in the way of progress." Hannah looked back at the riders. They looked powerful, dangerous. Yes, but there was a dignity to them that she had not seen in the dusty streets of the town. They were free in a way she had never been. In Boston, she had been a slave to the clock. Here, she was a prisoner of circumstance. But those men on the ridge belong to the land. Why do they stay if the soldiers hate them? Hannah asked. Because this is their home, Maggie replied, and they are proud. John Miller respected them. He was one of the few who did. Hannah looked at Maggie sharply. John respected them. Maggie nodded. John was a good man. He traded with them. He tried to keep the peace. Maybe that is why he ended up dead. The riders vanished over the ridge, disappearing like smoke. Hannah felt a strange pull in her chest, a mixture of fear and fascination. That night, Hannah rented a small room above the saloon with the last few dollars she had. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow bed and a wash basin. She lit a kerosene lamp and sat on the edge of the mattress. She reached into her bag and pulled out the packet of letters. She needed to hear his voice again, the voice of the man who had promised her a future. She unfolded the last letter John had sent, the paper worn thin from reading. Dear Hannah, the winters here are hard, but the springs are worth the wait. I am building a new room on the house, facing east so you can see the sunrise. It is a lonely life out here, but it is a good one. You do not have to be afraid of the wildness of this place. There is beauty in it. Hannah skipped down to the paragraph that had always puzzled her. I have a friend here, a man the town would call an enemy. He is a Comanche warrior who saved my life 2 winters ago when I was caught in a blizzard. We do not speak much of the same language, but we understand each other. If you come here, Hannah, you will not just see a ranch, you will see 2 worlds trying to live together. I hope you have the heart for it. She lowered the letter. 2 worlds trying to live together. Hannah thought of Major Cartwright's cold eyes. She thought of the dusty, hostile town. She thought of the kitchen downstairs where she would peel potatoes until her hands were raw. Or worse. The suggestion Maggie had made about the upstairs work if the kitchen did not pay enough. She walked to the small window. The town was dark now, save for the lanterns swinging outside the saloon. The wind howled, rattling the glass. It sounded like a lonely ghost. She had come here expecting a husband and a house. She had found a grave and a dead end. But as she looked out at the darkness where the Comanche riders had been, something hardened in Hannah's chest. She remembered the factory foreman who had told her she would starve without the mill. She remembered the landlord who had thrown her family's furniture on the street. She had survived them. She looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, but her chin was set. I am not going back. She whispered to the empty room. She did not know how she would survive. She did not know who this Comanche friend of John's was, or if he even cared that John was dead. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had died a spiritual death in Boston. She would not let this town bury her too. Hannah blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. Outside, the wind swept across the endless plains, wild and untamed, waiting for morning. The silence that fell over Dusty Creek on the following afternoon was not the peaceful quiet of the high plains, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that comes before a thunderstorm. Hannah Reed was in her small room above the saloon, splashing tepid water onto her face from the ceramic basin, when she heard the change in the rhythm of the town below. The usual clamor of the blacksmith hammer and the shouting of teamsters had ceased abruptly. She moved to the window, pulling back the rough muslin curtain just an inch. Below, the main street had cleared as if swept by a broom. Shopkeepers were turning signs to closed and latching shutters. Mothers were pulling children indoors with frantic urgency. Then she heard it, the rhythmic thudding of unshod hooves on hard-packed land. They appeared at the edge of town like a mirage taking solid form. A group of 6 riders, their silhouettes cutting sharp figures against the blinding white sun. They did not ride with the rigid, bouncing posture of the cavalry soldiers Hannah had seen at the station. These men moved with their horses, fluid and seamless, as if man and beast were a single organism. Leading them was a man who commanded attention without uttering a word. He sat atop a paint horse with a coat like spilled milk and obsidian. He wore buckskin leggings that had been darkened by grease and travel, and a calico shirt that had seen better days. His hair was the color of a raven wing, parted in the middle and wrapped in long, thick braids with strips of leather and red cloth. He carried a rifle in a scabbard across his back, but his hands were empty, resting easily on the reins. The people of Dusty Creek peeked from behind barrels and through cracked doors, their faces twisted in a mixture of hatred and terrified fascination. Hannah heard a man on the street below spit into the dirt and mutter a curse about savages. The riders did not stop at the edge of town. They rode straight down the center of the street, their horses stepping high and nervous, smelling the fear in the air. They stopped in front of the thirsty steer. Hannah felt her heart leap into her throat. She stepped back from the window, her hands trembling. She heard the heavy doors of the saloon downstairs swing open, followed by a silence so profound she could hear the buzzing of a fly against the window pane. She had to know, driven by an instinct she could not name. Hannah unlocked her door and moved to the top of the landing. Below, the saloon was frozen. The piano player sat with his hands hovering over the keys. The card players held their hands close to their chests, standing just inside the doors, the sunlight framing him in a halo of dust, was the leader of the riders. He was taller than he had looked from the window. His face was a landscape of sharp angles and bronze skin, his eyes dark and unreadable as he scanned the room. He ignored the glares of the buffalo hunters at the corner table and the hands that drifted toward pistol grips. He walked straight to the bar. Maggie stood there, her face pale beneath her rouge, but she did not reach for the shotgun she kept under the counter. She looked at the warrior and whispered a single word. Hawk. The warrior reached into a pouch at his belt. He pulled out a heavy hunting knife with a handle made of elk horn. He placed it gently on the polished wood of the bar. The sound of the metal connecting with the wood echoed in the quiet room. Hannah gasped softly from the top of the stairs. She recognized the description. In his letters, John Miller had described carving that knife handle during the long winter nights. He had carved his initials, J.M., into the base. "I bring this back," the warrior said. His voice was deep, resonating in his chest, and his English was surprisingly clear, though accented with the cadence of a language Hannah did not know. "It belongs to his kin." "He is dead then," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion. "The town said it was your kind that killed him. Hawk. They said a war party caught him near the canyon." A low rumble of agreement went through the room. A man at the back stood up, his hand resting on his holster. "That is a lie," the warrior said, not turning to look at the man. He kept his eyes on Maggie. "He died defending the herds." "Not from us, from the men who kill for skins and leave the meat to rot." The accusation hung in the air. The buffalo hunters in the corner shifted uneasily. Hawk reached into his pouch again and pulled out a piece of paper. It was stained with dirt and dark spots that looked dangerously like dried blood. He unfolded it with a care that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "He told me," Hawk said, looking down at the paper. "He told me there was a woman coming, a bride from the east. He made me promise that if the spirits took him, I would bring this to her. He did not want her to be alone." Maggie looked up, past the warrior, toward the stairs where Hannah stood in the shadows. Hannah felt the weight of the room shift toward her. She took a breath that shuddered in her lungs and stepped into the light. She descended the stairs slowly, the wood creaking under her worn boots. Every eye was on her, but Hannah only saw the warrior. As she reached the floor, he turned to face her, up close. He was terrifying and beautiful. He smelled of wood smoke, horse sweat, and sage. His eyes, which she had expected to be hard and cruel, held a depth of sorrow that surprised her. He looked at her not as a prize or an enemy, but as a person. "You are the one he waited for," Hawk said. It was not a question. "I am Hannah Reed," she managed to say. Her voice was small, but it did not break. Hawk held out the letter. "It is the last one he wrote. He could not post it." Hannah reached out, her pale fingers brushing against his dark, calloused hand. A spark, distinct and electric, seemed to jump between them. She took the paper. It was dated 3 weeks ago. She did not need to read it to know what it said. She could feel the intent of the man who wrote it. Before she could speak, the saloon doors swung open again. Major Henry Cartwright strode in, followed by 2 soldiers in blue uniforms. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to volatile. "I heard we had unwanted guests," the major said, his voice smooth and cold. He walked to the center of the room, looking at Hawk with a sneer of disdain. "You are far from your reservation lines, Hawk, and you are armed. I could have you shot where you stand for violating the treaty. I am here to return the property of a dead friend," Hawk responded calmly, "and to deliver a message to his widow." Widow Cartwright laughed, a harsh barking sound. "She is no widow. She was never married. She is just a stray woman with no prospects and no protection." Cartwright turned his eyes to Hannah, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. He looked at her as if she were a piece of land he intended to annex. "Miss Reed," the major said, "you should not be speaking to this savage. They are liars and thieves." It was likely his own hand that cut John Miller down, regardless of what fairy tales he spins. "He died saving the buffalo," Hannah said, her voice gaining strength. "He died fighting poachers." Cartwright narrowed his eyes. "Poachers are a problem for the law, not for Indians, but that is irrelevant. You are in a precarious position, Miss Reed. You have no money, no husband, and no home." He took a step closer to her, invading her personal space. The smell of expensive tobacco and starch was overwhelming. "I have made arrangements," the major continued. "You will come to Fort Glory. We have a need for women to assist with the domestic duties of the officers. You will be fed and housed. It is the only respectable option for a white woman alone in this territory." From behind the bar, Maggie made a sound of disgust. "Respectable? You mean you want a servant? You do not have to pay." "Henry, or worse, quiet." "Woman," Cartwright snapped. He looked back at Hannah. "The alternative is to stay here, in a saloon, and sell yourself to drunkards for copper pennies. Is that what you want?" Hannah looked around the room. She saw the leering faces of the buffalo hunters. She saw the pity in Maggie's eyes, but also the helplessness. She saw the major, standing there with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world. Then she looked at Hawk. He had not moved. He stood like a stone in a river, the current of the room breaking around him. He was watching her, waiting. He did not plead. He did not threaten. The major reached out to grab Hannah's arm. "Come along, Miss Reed. The wagon is waiting." Hawk moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for the soldiers to react. He stepped between Hannah and the major, his chest broad and imposing. He did not draw a weapon, but his presence was a barrier of iron. "Step aside, Indian," the major snarled, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. Hawk ignored him. He turned his back on the major, a gesture of ultimate disrespect, and looked directly at Hannah. The room held its breath. The click of a hammer being pulled back on a revolver echoed loudly. Hawk did not flinch. He looked into Hannah's eyes, and she saw the message John Miller had tried to send her across the miles. She saw the bridge between two worlds. "You do not belong in their cage," Hawk said softly. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to vibrate on the floorboards. "John wanted you to have a home, not a prison." He slowly extended his hand toward her. It was a hand that had known war, a hand that had skinned buffalo and broken horses, but it opened with a gentleness that stunned her. "Come with me," Hawk said. "Welcome home." Time seemed to stop. Hannah looked at the major, his face purple with rage. She looked at the soldiers, nervous and sweating. She looked at the grim reality of the saloon, the dust, the despair that hung in the corners. And then she looked at the open hand of the Comanche warrior. It was insane. It was social suicide. To take that hand was to burn every bridge she had ever known. It was to become an outcast, a pariah, a traitor to her race in the eyes of these men. But in that hand, she saw the only thing she had not seen since she left Boston. She saw dignity. She saw a choice. Major Cartwright growled, "If you touch him, girl, there is no coming back. You will be nothing but a squaw. You will be dead to civilized society." Hannah lifted her chin. Civilized society had let her brother die in a machine. Civilized society had let John Miller be murdered for trying to protect nature. Civilized society was a man with a gun trying to force her into servitude. Hannah reached out, her hand, pale and trembling, closed around Hawk's dark fingers. His grip tightened instantly, warm and solid and reassuring. A shockwave went through the room. Maggie gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Get her," the major shouted, but Hawk was already moving. He pulled Hannah close to his side, using his body as a shield between her and the soldiers. His other hand flashed to his belt, not for a weapon, but to whistle a sharp, piercing sound that shattered the air. The saloon doors burst open as the other 5 Comanche riders backed their horses right onto the porch, blocking the entrance and creating a wall of horseflesh and confusion. "Move," Hawk commanded. He swept Hannah out the door before the soldiers could get a clear shot. The bright sunlight blinded her for a second. Hawk grabbed her by the waist, his hand strong and sure, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. He swung her up onto the back of his paint horse. He vaulted up behind her in a single motion, grabbing the reins. Hannah instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the rough buckskin of his shirt. "Hold on!" he shouted, with a cry that sounded like the shriek of a hawk. He kicked the horse into a gallop. The animal surged forward, its muscles bunching and releasing with explosive power. They tore down the main street of Dusty Creek, the dust billowing in their wake. Behind them, Hannah heard the major shouting orders and the crack of a single pistol shot. The bullet went wide, lost in the wind. They rode hard, leaving the town behind, leaving the angry shouts and the judgment. The wind whipped Hannah's hair from its pins, sending it streaming behind her like a banner. She squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in Hawk's back, smelling the scent of him wild and earthy. They did not stop until the town was nothing but a smudge of gray smoke on the horizon. The sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in hues of blood and gold. Hawk slowed the horse to a trot, then a walk. The other riders fell in around them, silent sentinels. Hannah loosened her grip slightly, daring to open her eyes. They were out on the open prairie now. The world was vast, terrifyingly open. There were no walls, no ceilings, just the endless dome of the sky. Hawk shifted slightly, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "Are you well?" Hannah nodded against his shoulder, her throat too tight to speak. She was shaking, the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by the enormity of what she had done. "We will camp soon," Hawk said. "The horses need rest." They rode in silence for another hour, until they reached a small depression in the land where a creek trickled through a cluster of cottonwood trees. The riders dismounted with practiced ease. Hawk slid off the horse and reached up to help Hannah down. Her legs were wobbly when she hit the ground. She stumbled, and Hawk caught her, his hands steadying her elbows. For a moment, they stood close, the heat of the ride still radiating from their bodies. "Why?" Hannah asked, her voice raspy. "Why did you do that?" Hawk released her and turned to begin unsaddling the horse. "Because John Miller was my brother in all but blood. He told me you were coming to find a life. I could not leave you to find only a cage." He pulled the heavy saddle off and set it on the grass. He turned back to her, his expression serious. "But you must know, Hannah Reed, you have crossed a line today. The major will not forgive this. He wants the land my people live on. He wants the buffalo gone so the Iron Road can come. He will use you as an excuse to hunt us." Hannah looked at him, standing tall against the darkening sky. She thought of the letters in her bag. She thought of the empty, soulless eyes of the major. "I have been hunted by poverty and sickness my whole life," Hannah said quietly. "I have been trapped in factories and crowded rooms. Today on that horse was the first time I have breathed air that tasted like my own." Hawk studied her face, looking for the fear he expected to find. Instead, he saw a steeliness in her jaw that reminded him of the women of his own tribe. He nodded once, a gesture of respect. "We go north," Hawk said, "to the canyon where the winter camp is. It is a hard life. The wind cuts deep, and the nights are long." "I am not afraid of the cold," Hannah replied. "I am afraid of having no reason to wake up in the morning." Hawk gestured to the fire his men were building. "Then come, sit, eat." Hannah walked toward the fire. She was tired. Her body ached. And she was the only white woman in a camp of Comanche warriors. By all accounts, she should be terrified. But as she sat down on the blanket one of the men offered her, and watched the sparks spiral up toward the first stars of the evening, she felt a strange sensation settling in her chest. It was not quite happiness. It was too sharp, too dangerous for that. but it was a sense of rightness. She watched Hawk moving among his men, speaking in low tones, checking the horses. He was a part of this land, woven into it, and now, impossibly, she was woven into it too. She had arrived expecting nothing. She had found a war, but as Hawk caught her eye across the fire and gave her a barely perceptible nod, Hannah Reed realized something else. She had found a place to stand. They rode for 2 days, moving steadily north and west, deeper into the red rock canyons that cut through the plains like wounds. Hannah's body, unused to the rhythm of a horse, screamed in protest. Every muscle ached. Her skin was sunburned, her lips cracked, and her Boston dress was torn and stained with dust and horse sweat. Yet, she did not complain. She watched Hawk, noting how he read the land, how a subtle shift in the wind or the flight of a bird would cause him to change their course slightly. He was in a constant, silent conversation with the world around him. On the evening of the second day, they crested a high ridge. Hawk pulled his horse to a stop and pointed down. "My people," he said. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. Tucked into a wide valley, sheltered by sheer cliffs of sandstone and watered by a winding creek, was the Comanche camp. It was larger than she could have imagined. Dozens of teepees, made of pale buffalo hide, stood against the fading light, their tops breathing thin plumes of smoke into the twilight air. A massive herd of horses, hundreds strong, grazed in a meadow nearby, guarded by young boys on ponies. It was a scene of vibrant, chaotic life. Dogs barked, children shouted and ran between the lodges, and women tended to fires or worked on stretching hides across wooden frames. As Hawk led the small party down the winding trail into the valley, a silence fell over the camp. The barking of the dogs quieted. The children stopped their games. Every eye turned toward them, toward her. Hannah felt 1,000 pinpricks of scrutiny. The stares were not just curious. They were heavy with suspicion, hostility, and a raw, unveiled astonishment. A white woman, arriving in the heart of their camp, riding behind their lead warrior. The riders fanned out, disappearing toward their own lodges, leaving Hawk and Hannah alone in the center of the camp. Hawk dismounted in one fluid motion. He turned and offered his hands to help her down. Hannah's legs were so stiff she nearly collapsed when her feet touched the ground. Hawk's grip tightened on her arms, holding her steady for a moment longer than was necessary. He turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out in the Comanche language. Hannah could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was commanding, firm, and left no room for argument. The crowd did not disperse, but the tension eased by a fraction. An older woman emerged from the largest teepee near the center of the camp. She was tall for a woman, with a face that looked like it had been carved from wrinkled leather and eyes that held both immense sorrow and unbending strength. Her gray hair was pulled back in 2 thick braids. She wore a simple buckskin dress adorned with polished elk teeth. She walked straight to Hawk, ignoring Hannah completely. She spoke to him, her voice low and questioning. Hawk listened respectfully. His head bowed slightly. He answered, gesturing once toward Hannah, then speaking at length. The woman, whose name Hannah would learn was Atsa, finally turned her gaze. She looked Hannah up and down, from her ruined boots to her sunburned face. The look was not kind. It was assessing, as if she were inspecting a horse for flaws. Atsa spoke again, a sharp question. Hawk translated. She asks why I brought a ghost to our camp. Tell her, Hannah said, her voice hoarse, that this ghost is very tired and very hungry. Hawk's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. He translated. Atsa's expression did not change, but she gave a curt nod. She pointed to a small teepee near her own, one that was clearly used for storage. Then she pointed at Hannah and said one word. She gives you this lodge, Hawk said, and she says you will work. You are not a guest here. That night was the longest of Hannah's life. She was given a bowl of thick corn mush mixed with dried berries and strips of jerky so tough her jaw ached. She sat alone, trying to eat, acutely aware of the whispers and the sideways glances. She made the mistake of setting her empty bowl down on a decorated parfleche box, earning a sharp rebuke from a young woman. Later, She almost walked between a warrior and the central fire, and was yanked back hard by a small boy who hissed at her. Hawk had to intervene. "He is one of our sacred men," Hawk explained quietly, gesturing to the warrior. "You must never pass between him and the fire. He is making medicine." Hannah's face burned with humiliation. "I did not know. They do not care what you know," Hawk said, his voice flat. "They only care what you do. Do not step over anyone's belongings. Do not touch a man's weapons. And do not look a warrior in the eye unless you are challenging him." It felt like Boston all over again. Only the rules were more confusing, and the punishment for breaking them seemed far more severe. When she finally retreated to the small teepee, she could not sleep. She lay on a pile of buffalo robes, the sounds of the camp pressing in on her, the stamping and whickering of the horses, the low murmur of voices, and later, the rhythmic beat of a drum, accompanied by a high, keening song that seemed to pull the sadness from the earth itself. The stories she had been told in the East came rushing back, tales of scalping, of torture, of white women taken captive and never seen again. She clutched the small sewing kit in her bag, the last remnant of her old life. What had she done then? In the darkness, she remembered Hawk's hand reaching for hers in the saloon. She remembered his voice. "Welcome home." She was terrified. Yes, but it was a different fear than the one she had known in the factory. That was the fear of a slow, grinding death, of being consumed by indifference. This fear was sharp and clean and alive. She was balanced on a knife edge, and she had to learn to walk it. The next morning, Hawk came for her. He did not treat her as a prisoner, but as a responsibility. He walked her through the camp, and for the first time, she saw it not as a threat, but as a community. He showed her the women tanning the hides, their hands moving with incredible speed and skill. He showed her the old men mending arrows, their fingers gnarled but steady. He pointed out children, orphans whose parents had been killed in raids by the soldiers. "This is why we fight," Hawk said, his voice low. "We do not fight for land. We fight for them. We fight for the buffalo, which is our life. The white man kills it and leaves the meat to rot. It is a sickness." He told her about his own life. He had been sent to a mission school as a boy, part of a failed peace treaty. He learned English, learned the white man's religion, and saw the white man's greed. "They said my gods were devils," Hawk said, his eyes distant. "They said my people were savages. I read their books. Their God is a jealous God who lives in the sky. Our spirits are in the earth under our feet, in the water we drink, in the air we breathe." I decided to come home. Hannah began to understand the man beside her. He was not a simple warrior. He was a bridge, stretched taut between two worlds, and he was in danger of snapping. Atsa put Hannah to work. The older woman seemed to be in charge of the camp's provisions and the well-being of the women. She handed Hannah an awl and a pile of torn buckskin leggings. The message was clear. So, Hannah, whose hands had stitched fine silk for the wealthy women of Boston, now found herself struggling with thick, greasy hide. Her fingers, accustomed to fine needles, were clumsy with the bone awl. The thread, made of sinew, was stiff and unforgiving. Her first few stitches were a mess. A group of younger women, gathered nearby, watched her and laughed. They mimicked her fumbling, their high-pitched giggles stinging Hannah more than any insult. Hannah's face flushed with anger and shame. She threw the leggings down, her eyes stinging with tears. Atsa came over. She did not scold. She simply picked up the leggings, undid Hannah's poor stitches with a quick motion, and took Hannah's hand. She repositioned the awl, showed her how to push it through the leather with the heel of her palm, not her fingertips. She guided Hannah's hand through the motion. Once, twice, 3 times. Then she let go and walked away. Hannah picked up the awl again. She pushed. The sinew followed. It was not pretty, but it was a start. She worked all day, her fingers bleeding, her back aching, but she did not stop. By evening, she had repaired 3 pairs of leggings. Hawk walked by as the sun was setting. He paused, looking at the pile of mended clothing. He did not say anything, but he looked at Hannah, and his gaze was different. It held a flicker of something new. He knelt by her small fire and held out a piece of roasted prairie chicken on a stick. "It is better than the mush," he said. He was right. Not everyone was accepting. There was one warrior, younger than Hawk, with eyes that burned with a constant, simmering rage. His name was Kona. Hannah had seen him watching her, his expression one of pure hatred. One evening, as the men gathered after a hunt, Kona strode into the center of the camp. He pointed a finger at Hannah, who was helping Atsa grind corn. "Why is this white woman still breathing our air?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. He spoke in Comanche, but his anger was a universal language. Hawk stepped forward, his body placing him between Kona and Hannah. "She is here under my protection." "Kona! Your protection," Kona spat. "My wife and my son are dead. Killed by the blue coats you let this woman's people lead. She is a spy. She is a bad omen." The camp grew dangerously quiet. This was a challenge. Hawk's face was stone. "She is the promised wife of John Miller, who was my friend. He died because he stood with us, against men of her color. She has no one. I've given my word." "Your word is soft," Kona lunged, not at Hawk, but at Hannah. Hawk moved like a snake, striking. He caught Kona by the chest and threw him to the ground. He did not draw a knife. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood over him, his shadow covering the younger warrior. "You will not touch her," Hawk said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly promise. "You have lost much. We all have. But you will not spill your hate on this woman. She is not the one who killed your family." Kona lay on the ground, his chest hewing, tears of rage and grief streaming down his face. He scrambled to his feet and stalked off into the darkness, defeated but not changed. Hannah was shaking. She looked at Hawk, the protector, the warrior who had just defended her, but Atsa merely shoved the grinding stone back into her hands. The message was clear. The drama was over. The work remained. A few days later, Hannah earned her place in a way she never could have planned. She was gathering firewood by the creek when a group of children ran past, shouting and playing, chasing each other toward the horse herd. One of the older geldings, spooked by the sudden noise, reared up, its eyes rolling. A small boy, no more than 4 years old, tripped and fell directly into the horse's path. The horse's front hooves came down, missing him by inches, and it prepared to strike again. The other children froze in terror. Hannah did not think. She dropped the wood and lunged. She threw her body at the boy, grabbing him and rolling, just as the horse's hooves slammed down on the spot where he had been. Hannah landed hard, scraping her arm and side on the rocky ground, the boy safe but screaming in her arms. Warriors and women came running, Hawk and Atsa at the front. They saw Hannah, bleeding from a long gash on her arm, soothing the crying child. They saw the hoof prints in the dust. Atsa took the boy from Hannah's arms, checking him for injury. When she saw he was unharmed, she handed him to his mother and turned back to Hannah. For the first time, the older woman's eyes softened. She reached out and touched the blood on Hannah's arm. She nodded, a single, sharp gesture of approval. It was worth more to Hannah than a chest of gold. That night, Hawk watched Hannah as she sat by Atsa's fire. The other women had made space for her. They were sharing food. And one of them was gently applying a poultice of herbs to Hannah's injured arm. He saw her differently now. He had brought her here out of a sense of duty to a dead friend. He had protected her because it was his word. But he had seen her lunge toward the horse, an act of selfless courage. She was not the fragile, pale ghost he had first seen. There was iron in her. Later, as the camp settled into sleep, Hannah sat outside her teepee, watching the stars. The prairie sky was so vast, so full of light. It made her feel small, but in a good way. A shadow fell over her. It was a hawk. He was holding a thick, soft buffalo robe, one that was clearly finer than the one she'd been given. "The wind changes," he said. "The nights will be cold from now on. The wind does not pity anyone." He draped the heavy robe over her shoulders. His hands lingered for a moment, his fingers brushing the side of her neck as he adjusted the fur. It was not a lover's caress. It was a gesture of care, of provision, but his skin was hot against hers, a stark contrast to the cooling air. The touch was brief, accidental. But it sent a jolt through Hannah that was as potent as a lightning strike. It was a small warmth in the vast, cold darkness, a heat that felt more real and more dangerous than any fire. He stepped back, his face unreadable in the starlight. "Sleep well, Hannah Reed." He turned and was gone, as silent as the shadow he cast, leaving Hannah to pull the robe tighter, the scent of smoke and sage and the lingering warmth of his touch surrounding her. The fragile peace of the canyon camp was shattered by the arrival of a single, hurried mule. Silas, a gray-bearded trader who had long exchanged coffee and flour for Comanche-painted robes, rode in not with his usual jovial greeting, but with a face tight with fear. He slipped from his mule and went directly to Hawk and Atsa, who were examining a new hide. He spoke in a low, urgent voice that cut through the morning air. "Hawk, I was at Fort Glory 2 days ago. Major Cartwright is not sitting still. He's gathering men, not just soldiers, but every out-of-work buffalo hunter and drifter who hates your people. He is telling them he needs to mount a rescue." Hawk's eyes narrowed. "A rescue?" Silas nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "He is using the woman. He is telling the railroad men that his territory is unstable because his citizens are being taken captive. He plans to march in here, find you, and he says he will. Quote, cleanse this canyon of its heathen threat. End quote." Atsa's hand still on the hide. "He means to make a war," she said. "He means to make a slaughter," Silas corrected. "And he is using Hannah Reed as his excuse. He will march in here and claim you fired first. By the time the truth gets to a telegraph, your people will be bones and he will be a hero." Hawk's jaw was a line of granite. "He will not have her, and he will not use her name to murder my people." That evening, the elders gathered in Atsa's lodge. The air was thick with the smoke of the pipe and the heavier weight of fear. Kona, his face a mask of rage, argued for a preemptive strike, to attack the fort, to fight like warriors, and be killed like warriors, Atsa countered, her voice sharp. "The blue coats have cannons. They have rifles that fire many times. We have bows and courage. It is not enough." Then what Kona demanded. "We wait here to be butchered like the herds know." Atsa looked across the fire, her eyes landing on Hannah, who sat beside Hawk, listening, her hands clenched in her lap. "We fight with weapons they do not expect. We fight with the truth." She turned her gaze to Hannah. "You are his excuse," she said, her Comanche words translated instantly by Hawk. "You must be our defense. You are a white woman. You speak their language. They will listen to you and they will only shoot at us." "Me," Hannah said, her heart lumping in her throat. "Go back to Dusty Creek, not just to the town," Hawk said, his voice low. "To the fort. We will go together. We will stand before the Major. We will offer peace. We will offer to move deeper into the Badlands, away from his precious iron road. We will do this in front of his men, and in front of the decent people of the town." Atsa nodded. "You will go to the saloon woman. You will go to the preacher. You will tell them we come in peace, and that you are not a prisoner. You will make the Major show his hand, if he is forced to admit his plans. He cannot claim it is a defensive war." It was a terrifying prospect. To walk back into the town that despised her, to face the man who had tried to enslave her. But as Hannah looked at Atsa's proud face, and at Hawk's, she knew they were right. She had become the pivot point of this conflict. She nodded once. "I will go." They left before dawn the next day, just the two of them. They rode fast, not on Hawk's paint horse, but on two swift, wiry ponies bred for speed and endurance. They carried dried meat, water, and 2 rifles. One was Hawk's. The other, he had taken from its scabbard and handed it to her. It was John Miller's. She realized, her hands closing around the familiar wooden stock. Hawk saw her recognition. "He would want you to have it. Do you know how to use it? I have shot rabbits," Hannah said, "but never at a man." "Good," Hawk replied grimly. "A man is an easier target. Aim for the center. Do not think, just act." They avoided the main trails, cutting through high mesas and dry riverbeds. The land was beautiful and deadly. On the second day, as they crossed a wide, open prairie, Hawk suddenly pulled his horse to a halt. He held up a hand. "Listen." Hannah strained her ears. At first, she heard nothing but the wind. Then, she heard it. the distant thunder of hooves, too many to be a stray herd, and then the faint crack of a rifle shot. He pointed to a plume of dust rising in the west. Buffalo hunters. And they are riding hard. They must have seen us. Another shot, this one closer. A small puff of dust kicked up 50 yards to their left. "They are shooting at us," Hannah cried, her voice thin with panic. "Of course," Hawk said, his face calm and hard. He grabbed the reins of her horse. "Ride. Do not look back. Do not stop. Ride for the canyon." The next hour was a blur of terror and chaos. The ponies ran, their small hooves flying over the ground. But the hunters were on larger horses, and they were gaining. Bullets whined past their heads. Hawk unslung his rifle and fired back, a single shot, forcing the hunters to swerve. He was a brilliant rider, weaving and turning, making them a difficult target. But there were 6 of them. The canyon. "Hannah," he yelled. Straight ahead, a narrow cleft in the rock appeared before them. They plunged into it, the air cooling instantly. The sound of the rifles echoed off the stone walls. "Keep going," Hawk shouted, pulling his horse back to stand guard at the entrance. Hannah rode deeper, her heart pounding. She heard Hawk's rifle crack again, followed by an angry yell from their pursuers. Then he was riding after her, galloping to catch up. "The hunters will not follow us in here," he said, his horse slowing to a walk. "They know this is our land, but they will wait for us at the mouth." They rode in silence for another mile, the canyon walls rising higher around them, and then the sky, which had been a clear, harsh blue, turned a bruised purple. The wind died, and the air grew heavy. "Rain," Hawk said, looking up. "A big storm. We must find shelter." He urged his horse forward. The first fat drops began to splat against the dry rocks as they rounded a bend. Tucked into the canyon wall was a shallow cave, barely more than an overhang, but it was dry. "Here," he commanded, sliding from his horse. They tumbled inside, pulling the horses in close for shared warmth. The sky opened. Rain came down not in drops, but in a solid gray sheet, turning the canyon floor into a raging river of mud within minutes. A thunder cannon crashed overhead, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the mountains. Hannah sank to the cave floor, shivering, her thin buckskin dress plastered to her body. She was soaked to the skin, and a cold wind was now howling down the canyon. Hawk worked quickly, pulling the saddlebags and the heavy buffalo robe from his horse. He spread the robe on the ground. "We must make you dry," he said, his voice practical. He handed her a piece of oiled cloth from his bag. She tried to rub her arms and face, but her fingers were numb, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely hold it. Hawk knelt in front of her. He sighed. A small puff of white mist in the cold air. He took the cloth from her hands and began to rub her arms himself, his movements rough and efficient, forcing the blood back to the surface. Hannah flinched at the contact, but the friction was bringing warmth. "We will freeze if we stay like this," he said, his voice low and serious. He untied the buffalo robe. "We must share it. It is the only way." Hannah hesitated, but the violent shaking in her limbs made the decision for her. She nodded, unable to speak. He sat on the robe, his back against the stone wall, and pulled her down beside him. He wrapped the heavy fur around both of them, cocooning them in a small, dark world of shared heat. Hannah was rigid at first. She was pressed against him from shoulder to knee. She could feel the hard muscle of his thigh against hers, the solid wall of his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart under her ear, a rhythm slower and calmer than her own frantic pulse. He still smelled of smoke and leather, now mixed with the clean, sharp scent of rain. She was pressed against a man the world called a savage. Yet, she had never felt safer. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside. "Are you afraid?" he asked finally, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Of the storm," Hannah whispered. "Of me." She tilted her head back to look at him in the dim light. His face was close, his expression unreadable. "No," she said, and it was the truth. "I am not afraid of you. I'm afraid of Major Cartwright. I'm afraid of what his world does to people. It made me small. It made me a coward." "You are not a coward," Hawk said. "I have seen you face down Kona. I saw you pull that child from under the horse. You are not a coward." She let out a shaky breath. "I'm afraid of being dragged back, afraid of him winning." "He will not win," Hawk said. "I'm afraid for you," Hannah admitted, her voice dropping. "I'm afraid of what will happen to your people, and to you." He was silent for a long moment. Then, his arm, which was resting on top of the robe, moved. He slowly, deliberately, put it around her shoulders, pulling her even closer. "I am also afraid," he said. "I have not been afraid of death for many winters, but I am afraid of losing this. I am afraid of losing our house." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder. His skin was hot, even through the damp buckskin. The cold was outside, but in here, there was a furnace. She felt him turn his head. She looked up. His face was only inches away. His dark eyes searched hers, and she saw a vulnerability she had never seen before. He was not just a warrior. He was a man, and he was as lost in this storm as she was. He leaned down, his movement so slow it was barely perceptible. It was a question, not a demand. He was giving her every chance to turn away. Hannah did not turn away. She rose up slightly, meeting him halfway. His lips touched hers. It was not a kiss like she had read about in books. It was not a spark or a fire. It was something more essential. It was the taste of rain, smoke, and earth. It was a kiss that held no violence, no possession. It was a promise of warmth in the cold, a promise of shelter in the storm. He pulled back slowly, resting his forehead against hers. They breathed the same air. "The world is trying to kill us. Hannah Reed," he whispered. "Then we must not let it happen," she replied. They stayed like that, wrapped in the robe and the sound of the rain, until the storm passed and the first gray light of morning crept back into the world. They rode into Dusty Creek late that afternoon. The townspeople stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of shock and disgust. Hannah was no longer the pale victim from the east. She was riding a Comanche pony, wearing a borrowed pair of buckskin trousers under her torn dress, her hair in a single thick braid, and she was riding beside Hawk. They ignored the whispers and went straight to the thirsty steer. Maggie was behind the bar. When she saw Hannah, she dropped a glass, which shattered on the floor. "Dear God, child," Maggie breathed. Rushing around the bar, she grabbed Hannah by the shoulders, her eyes searching. "Did he hurt you?" Hannah gently took Maggie's hands. "No, Maggie, I am not hurt. I am here because I chose to be." She looked back at Hawk, who stood by the door, watching, his rifle held loosely in his hand. "We are here," Hannah said, turning back to Maggie, her voice clear and strong, "to stop Major Cartwright from starting a war." The meeting at Fort Glory was exactly as cold as Hannah had expected. Major Cartwright sat behind his large oak desk, a picture of civilized authority. He did not offer them a seat. "Miss Reed," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "You have returned. I am so relieved. We had feared the worst." "I was, in fact, just organizing a party to retrieve you. I did not need retrieving." "Major," Hannah said, standing tall, "I came of my own free will." Cartwright laughed softly. "Deluded, poor child. These savages have a way of twisting the mind. But you are safe now. You will stay here, at the fort, under my personal protection." "She does not need your protection," Hawk said, his voice filling the room. He stepped forward. "We come to offer peace. My people wish to live. We will move our camp further south, away from the railroad. We will not hunt on the lands your surveyors have marked. We only ask that you call off your hunters and leave us be." Cartwright looked at him as if he were an interesting insect. "You are in no position to offer terms. You are off your reservation. You are armed. And you are in possession of a white woman. By law, I should have you hanged." He stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of Hannah. His eyes were cold. "Stay here, Hannah. I will give you a good room, a warm bed. You can forget this nightmare." Hannah did not flinch. It was not a nightmare. "Major, it was the only honest life I have found in this territory. We are offering you peace. If you refuse, The blood of women and children will be on your hands." The major's face hardened. His mask of civility slipped. "I will take your offer under advisement," he said curtly. "Now, get this savage out of my office, Miss Reed. You will remain." Hannah shook her head. "I go where he goes." Cartwright's eyes flashed with rage. "Fine, be a fool, but when you are starving and freezing, do not come crawling back to me. Now get out." A young adjutant was called to escort them from the fort. As they walked down the hallway, Hannah felt a wave of dizziness, the exhaustion and fear finally catching up to her. She stumbled, grabbing the wall for support. The adjutant paused, impatient. It was then, in that moment of stillness, that she heard it. Cartwright's office door was slightly ajar. His voice, no longer smooth, carried clearly into the hall. He was speaking to someone else, a voice Hannah recognized as one of the buffalo hunters. "It is perfect," the major was saying. They walked right in, offering peace. "The girl's testimony makes them look innocent." "I do not see how that is perfect." "Major." The hunter grumbled. "Because, you fool." Cartwright sneered. "No one expects an attack on a peaceful camp. Let them ride back. Let them tell their people the peace is working. And at dawn, tomorrow, we ride. We ride into that canyon and we finish this." "What about the girl?" the hunter asked. "What about her? She is a traitor. We will say she was killed in the crossfire. A tragic accident. The Railroad Commission will be so grateful." Hannah's blood turned to ice. It was a trap. A genocide. She grabbed Hawk's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "Now!" she hissed. Hawk did not need to be told twice. He saw the look of pure terror on her face, and he reacted. He shoved the adjutant so hard the man flew back against the wall. "Run!" Hawk yelled. He grabbed Hannah's hand and they sprinted down the hall, out into the parade ground, toward their horses. An alarm bell began to ring. Shouts erupted behind them. They vaulted onto their ponies, Hawk not even using the stirrups. He kicked his horse into a gallop, and they charged out of the fort gates, a few wild shots ringing out behind them. The sky, which had cleared, was now darkening again, the promise of the earlier storm finally fulfilling itself. Night fell, and the rain began again, this time mixed with the fury of a thunderstorm. They rode into the teeth of it, a desperate, terrifying race against time. The world was pitch black, lit only by brief, blinding flashes of lightning. Hannah could not see the ground, the sky, or anything but Hawk's back as she rode blindly after him. At one point, they came to a river, swollen and raging from the rain. "We must cross," Hawk shouted over the roar of the water. He plunged his horse in, and Hannah followed, the icy water grabbing at her legs, the current trying to pull her under. Her horse stumbled, but Hawk was there, grabbing its bridle, pulling them both forward, to safety on the other side. They stopped only once, huddled in the lee of a massive boulder to let the horses breathe. Hannah was shaking, not from cold, but from a cold, pure rage. "He is going to kill them," she sobbed, pounding her fist against her leg. "He's going to kill Atsa, the children. We will be faster," Hawk said, his voice grim. "We must." Hannah grabbed the front of his wet shirt. "Hawk, I need you to know, when I came to this land, I was running from a life I hated. I was empty, but now I am not running from anything. I am riding home, to our people." Hawk's hands came up to frame her face. The rain plastered his long hair to his skin. In the flash of lightning, she saw the fierce, burning intensity in his eyes. "I knew," he said, his voice thick, "the moment you put your hand in mine at the saloon. I knew you were not like them. I knew I had broken the world in two for you, and I do not regret it." He pulled her close and kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of rain and fear and a terrible, shared resolve. "Now we ride," he said, pulling away. "We ride for their lives." He swung back onto his horse, pulled her up behind him onto his own, and they plunged back into the storm, two souls riding as one against the dawn. They rode the lathered horses into the canyon just as the sky in the east was turning a pale, sickly gray. The camp was asleep, shrouded in the pre-dawn mist. Only a few sentries, their forms huddled by low burning embers, looked up in alarm as the horses clattered on the rocks. Hawk slid from the horse before it even stopped, pulling a nearly unconscious Hannah down with him. He half carried her to the center of the camp, shouting a command that brought heads and a sleeping camp to sudden, panicked life. Atsa was the first one out of her lodge, her face grim. "They are coming," Hawk said, his voice raw. "The Major, he plans a massacre." At dawn, the word spread through the awakening camp like wildfire. Panic erupted. Women grabbed for their children. Men ran for weapons. Into the rocks a man shouted, pointing to the high cliffs. "We must flee Kona." His face a mask of fury. Held his rifle high. "Flee! We flee to where he will hunt us. We fight, we die here, on our land." As warriors, the camp fractured into chaos. Atsa's sharp voice cut through the noise. "Be silent." She stood tall, her eyes finding Hawk and Hannah. "You have seen this. What do you say we cannot outrun them?" Hawk said. "And we cannot fight them head on." He looked at the canyon walls. "But we can fight them on our terms. We will move the children, the old, and the women who do not wish to fight. Send them deep into the caves, up the high trails into the forest, and the rest of us," Kona demanded. "The rest of us," Hawk said, his eyes glinting with a cold fire. "We'll make them pay for every step they take in this canyon. We set traps for the horses. We smoke. We fire from the cliffs. We will bleed them." It was a desperate plan, and everyone knew it. They were buying time, not victory. Hannah, who had been leaning against Hawk, her body trembling, pushed herself upright. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "That is not enough. He is using me as his excuse. We must take that excuse away." All eyes turned to her. "Atsa," Hannah said, walking toward the old woman. "In my bag, my last Boston dress, there is a white lace shawl. Get it for me." Atsa looked confused, but she nodded to a young girl, who ran to Hannah's small teepee. "When the soldiers come," Hannah continued, her voice gaining strength, "they will expect to see savages. They will expect a fight. And they will find one," Kona roared. "They will find me," Hannah said, cutting him off. "I will stand in the open, where they can all see me. I will hold the white cloth. I will tell them I am here by my own choice. I will tell them this is a camp for families. I will name Henry Cartwright as a murderer in front of his own men." Silence. The plan was insane. It was suicide. Hawk grabbed her arm. "Hannah, no, they will shoot you. The first bullet will be for you. They will not shoot a white woman holding a white flag in front of 100 witnesses." Hannah argued, her eyes blazing. "Not all of them are murderers. He is counting on them being afraid. I am counting on them being men." Atsa looked at Hannah, a long, deep look. Then she nodded slowly. "The spirits have sent us a strange weapon," she said. "A pale woman with an iron spine. Let her do it." The young girl returned with the shawl. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, a memory of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Hawk turned to his warriors. His debate with Hannah lost. "Move. Get the families to the rocks, Kona. Take the high ridge. Do not fire until I say." The camp dissolved in a frantic, organized panic. Women grabbed sleeping children and ran for the hills. Warriors melted into the rocks, their faces painted for war. Just as the first true light of the sun touched the rim of the canyon, a bugle call, sharp and terrible, echoed from the mouth of the valley. It was the sound of the civilized world, and it was a promise of death. The attack began. A line of blue-coated soldiers on horseback charged into the valley, their sabers drawn, their rifles firing. Behind them, whooping and yelling, came the buffalo hunters, a ragged mob hungry for blood. The ground erupted in front of them. The Comanche had dug pits, covered with hides and dust. Horses screamed as their legs snapped, throwing riders to the ground. From the cliffs above, a shower of arrows fell, silent and deadly. Warriors whooped, their calls echoing like ghosts, making their numbers seem larger than they were. They set fire to bundles of wet sage, and a thick, choking smoke filled the canyon floor, blinding the soldiers, scattering their charge. It was chaos. It was smoke, and gunfire, and the screams of men and horses. Major Henry Cartwright sat on his black stallion on a rise near the canyon mouth, directing the attack, his face a mask of satisfaction. In the middle of it all, Hannah Reed walked out from behind a large boulder. She held the white lace shawl in her hand, her arm high. She was terrified. Her knees were weak, her stomach a cold knot. but she walked. She walked into the open space between the burning teepees and the charging line of soldiers. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice surprisingly powerful in the sudden lull as the soldiers saw her. "Stop!" A young soldier, his face no older than her dead brother's, reined in his horse, his mouth falling open in shock. "My name is Hannah Reed," she shouted, her voice carrying over the smoke. "I am a citizen of the United States. I am not a prisoner." The first line of soldiers wavered, their charge breaking. They looked at each other in confusion. "This is a peaceful camp," Hannah continued, tears of rage and fear streaming down her face. "There are women and children here. Major Cartwright knows this. He lied to you. He is the one who murdered John Miller." "That is a lie," Cartwright's voice roared from the ridge. "She is a traitor. A squaw. Fire on them, fire." A few of the buffalo hunters, loyal only to the promise of violence, raised their rifles. Hawk, who had been watching from the rocks, his heart stopping with every step she took, saw it happen. He saw a hunter take aim at Hannah. He screamed her name, a raw, guttural sound. He broke cover, running, diving, tackling her to the ground just as the rifle cracked. Hannah felt a searing, white, hot pain. A bullet had grazed her arm, cutting a bloody line through her sleeve. But Hawk had taken the brunt of it. He cried out, a sound of agony, as another bullet slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around. He fell over her, a dead weight, blood pouring from his wound. "Hawk," she screamed, pushing him off, seeing the dark stain spreading across his buckskin shirt. He groaned, pushing himself up onto one elbow, his face pale and twisted in pain. He grabbed his bow, which had fallen nearby, from the ridge. Kona saw Hawk fall. He saw the major. With a howl of pure rage, he and his warriors rose from the rocks, a volley of arrows flying toward Cartwright. Cartwright's horse reared as arrows landed around it. He fought it under control, his face purple. He saw Hawk on the ground, struggling to stand, shielding Hannah. The major raised his revolver, taking careful aim. "This ends." "Savage," he sneered. "Get away from him." "Hannah," he shouted. "He has poisoned you." Hannah looked from the man she loved, bleeding on the ground, to the man who represented everything she hated. Hawk. His bow was in his hand. He had an arrow nocked. His arm was shaking from the wound, but his aim was steady. He had a clear shot, right at the major's black heart. From the cliffs, Kona's voice was a scream. "Kill him! Hawk, avenge my wife! Avenge our people!" Hawk drew the bowstring back, his muscles straining. This was it, the man who had caused all this, the man who had murdered John Miller, the man who was destroying their world. One shot. Hannah saw the choice in his eyes. She saw the rage, the grief, and the desire for vengeance. And she knew what it would cost. "No," she whispered, grabbing his uninjured arm. "Hawk, no!" Her voice was quiet, almost lost in the gunfire. "If you kill him now," she pleaded, looking into his eyes, "you make him a martyr. They will use it as an excuse to hunt us all to the end of the earth. They will say we are what he said we were." Hawk's arm trembled. The bowstring was tight. He looked at Hannah, her face streaked with blood and dirt. He looked at Cartwright, his face a mask of arrogant hatred, and he made his choice. He shifted his aim. He released the arrow. It flew, not at Cartwright's chest, but at his head. The arrow did not kill. It struck the major's hat, ripping it from his head and sending it flying. The force of the impact, combined with his horse's nervous dancing, was enough. The major toppled sideways out of his saddle, landing in an undignified heap in the mud. A stunned silence fell over the canyon. The gunfire sputtered and died. Hawk struggled to his feet, his wounded shoulder screaming, but he stood. He pointed at the major, who was scrambling in the mud for his pistol. "You see," Hawk shouted, his voice ringing against the rocks. "Clear for every soldier to hear. You see the man you follow. He orders you to fire on a white woman. He orders you to murder children in their sleep. He is the savage." The soldiers sat on their horses, frozen. They looked at the major, covered in mud, his face twisted with a fury that was almost inhuman. They looked at Hannah, her white arm stained red with blood. They looked at the empty teepees, the small toys scattered on the ground. A young adjutant, the same one who had been in the fort, rode his horse forward slowly. He looked at the major, and his face was filled with a dawning, terrible understanding. "Major Cartwright." "Sir," the adjutant said, his voice shaking but firm. "I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy and the attempted murder of a United States citizen." "What?" Cartwright howled, getting to his feet. "You are arresting me." "I am your commanding officer. I will have you shot, number, sir," the adjutant said, drawing his own pistol. "You will not." He turned to the stunned soldiers. "Men, stand down. This is over." The buffalo hunters, seeing the military command collapse, did not wait for an invitation to leave. They saw their payday and their chance for a massacre. Disappearing, cursing, they wheeled their horses around and galloped out of the canyon, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The battle, which had begun with a bugle, ended in a stunned, heavy silence. The cost was high. 2 warriors were dead. Several others were injured. The camp was in ruins. Teepees burned. Provisions scattered. But it was not a massacre. Hawk stood for a moment longer, a look of grim triumph on his face. Then the strength left him. His knees buckled. Hawk Hannah screamed, catching him as he fell. He collapsed into her arms, his blood hot and wet against her hands. He was heavy, and she struggled to hold him, lowering him gently to the ground. "You bled," he whispered, his fingers weakly touching the gauze on her arm. "It is nothing," she said, her voice breaking as she tore a strip from her dress to press against his shoulder. "It is nothing. You are alive." She looked up, her eyes blurred with tears, at the canyon full of smoke and soldiers. She saw Atsa and the other women and children beginning to emerge from the rocks, their face etched with terror and relief. They had not won, but they had not lost. They had survived. They had held on to the truth, and in this brutal, unforgiving land. Sometimes that was the only victory that mattered. The soldiers did not leave immediately. The young adjutant, whose name was Lieutenant Davies, posted guards and sent a rider back to Fort Glory with a full report and a request for a military surgeon. He treated Hawk and the other wounded Comanche with a stiff, formal respect that was a universe away from Cartwright's disdain. Major Cartwright himself was held under guard in a storage teepee, his furious, muffled shouts ignored by everyone. Inside Hawk's lodge, the air was thick with the smell of blood and boiled herbs. Hannah worked with a focus that kept her terror at bay. Atsa had brought her a poultice of yarrow and sage, and Hannah was cleaning the wound on Hawk's shoulder. The bullet had torn through the muscle, a deep, ragged gash that had bled profusely. Miraculously, it passed clean through without shattering the bone. Hawk was lying on a pile of furs, his skin pale and slick with sweat. He had not made a sound as she cleaned the wound, but his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. "You are a terrible patient," Hannah whispered, her hands shaking as she tied the bandage. "You are supposed to be complaining." Hawk let out a long, shuddering breath. His eyes opened, finding hers. "And you are a terrible nurse," he rasped. "You are meant to look soft and sympathetic, not like you are at war with my shoulder." A small, hysterical laugh escaped her. "I'm at war with it. It is trying to take you from me. I will not let it." His good hand, calloused and stained, came up. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a streak of grime and dried tears. "Your arm," he said, his gaze dropping to the bloody bandage on her own arm. "It is a scratch," Hannah said, leaning into his touch, her eyes closing for just a second. "It is nothing." He was silent for a moment. He tried to sit up, but a wave of pain and dizziness hit him, and he fell back with a groan. "Do not move," she ordered, pushing him gently back down. "I'm not good at being still," he admitted. "I know," she said. She sat back on her heels, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving her hollow and trembling. The full weight of the day, of the bullets, of the blood, crashed down on her. A sob she could not control tore from her throat. "Hannah!" His voice was sharp, cutting through her rising panic. She looked at him, her vision blurred. "You are not alone," he said, his voice quiet but fierce. "Not in the cave, not here. Do not break. Not yet." She took a ragged breath, nodding. She wiped her face with her bloody hands, leaving streaks of red and black. She would not break. He needed her. He reached for her hand, pulling her closer. She sat on the edge of the firs, her hip pressed against his. "When I saw you walk into the smoke," he whispered, his eyes dark with the memory. "When I saw that hunter raise his rifle, I thought my spirit had left my body. I thought I had lost everything." "You lost nothing," she said, her voice thick. "We are here. We are alive." He turned his hand, lacing his fingers with hers. It was a promise, an anchor. He pulled her down, slowly, until her head was resting on his uninjured shoulder. She felt the heat of his fever, the unsteady beat of his heart. He kissed the top of her head, a slow, gentle pressure that spoke more than any words. "Rest, Hannah Reed," he murmured. "The fighting is done, for today." They stayed like that, a warrior and a seamstress, two broken pieces leaning on each other, while the camp outside began to mourn its dead and rebuild its life. The next day, a council was held. The military surgeon, a weary man who had seen too much, had tended to the wounded of both sides. Lieutenant Davies had formally apologized to Atsa, offering military rations as a token of goodwill, which she accepted with a dignity that shamed him. Hawk, his arm in a sling and his face pale, sat with the elders. Hannah sat behind him, a recognized part of the circle. Kona spoke first, his voice heavy. "2 brothers are gone. Our homes are burned. This is not a victory." "No," Atsa said, her eyes on the ground. "It is not, but we are not gone. We are not on a reservation. We are not being marched to the sickness lands." She looked at Hawk. "Your choice not to kill the major, it was a wise one, if you had. These soldiers would have had no choice but to slaughter us to avenge their commander. Instead, they are ashamed." Lieutenant Davies came to the council fire, his hat in his hand. He stood before them, a young man with an old burden. "I have sent my report," he said, his voice clear. "Major Cartwright is relieved of his command. He will be sent back east for a full court-martial." A ripple of low approval went through the Comanche. "But this cannot be the end," Davies continued. "The railroad is coming. More settlers will follow. This valley is on the maps now. You cannot stay here." Then where Kona's hand tightened on his rifle, "You push us, until we fall off the world." Davies looked uncomfortable. "There is territory. To the south, drier land, more isolated. It is not good land for cattle or for farms. It is land no white man wants." Hawk translated grimly. Davies had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes, that is what it is, but I can offer you a treaty. A real one. Signed by me, representing the army, and you. Your people will settle there. You will be guaranteed that land. You will not raid the trails, and the army will not cross its borders. It is the best I can do." The elders debated in their own language. It was a bad choice. It was a dry, hard land. But it was a choice. It was an offer of life, not extermination. Atsa looked at Hawk, and she looked at Hannah. "We will need a translator," Atsa said, speaking in English for all to hear. "We will need a bridge." All eyes settled on Hannah. The journey back to Dusty Creek was a strange one. Hannah rode beside Hawk, who sat his horse stiffly, his face drawn with pain. Lieutenant Davies and a small contingent of soldiers rode with them. The town, when they arrived, was buzzing with the news. The story had already arrived, twisted and magnified. Some said the Comanche had massacred the army. Others said a white squaw was leading a war party. They rode straight to the church, where the town preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Brown, had agreed to host the meeting. Maggie was there, her face a mask of worry. She rushed to Hannah, hugging her tightly. "They said you were dead, child." Maggie wept, holding her. "I am not," Hannah said, patting her back. "But I am very tired." Maggie. The meeting was a tense affair. Lieutenant Davies laid out the facts, his voice precise. He described the major's treachery, the plan to massacre a peaceful camp, and Hannah's bravery. Hannah, her voice quiet but unwavering, told her story. She told them about John Miller's death. She told them she had not been a prisoner. "I went with them," she said to the stunned faces of the townspeople, "because in a town that offered me a choice between a brothel and servitude, a Comanche warrior was the only man who offered me a home." The silence that followed was profound. The preacher cleared his throat. Maggie stood with her arms crossed, glaring at the men who had once looked at Hannah with such disdain. Hawk, his arm in the sling, stood beside her. He did not speak, But his presence was a powerful statement. The treaty was laid out on the church table. It was simple, and it was brutal in its honesty. It defined the borders of the new territory. Reverend Brown looked at it. "It is a difficult land." "Lieutenant, it is a land of peace," Davies replied. "And that is more than they had yesterday." Hawk signed with a mark. The elders did the same. Hannah signed her name as a witness, her clean Boston script looking alien on the rough military document. That night, Hannah stayed with Maggie in a small room above the saloon. It was the first time she had slept in a real bed in weeks. It felt too soft, too confining. Maggie sat with her, brushing her hair, which was now long and coarse from the sun and wind. "You do not have to go back, you know," Maggie said softly. "You are a hero, of a sort, the town they are afraid of. But they respect you now. You could stay. You could open that seamstress shop you talked about. You could have a good, safe life." Hannah looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. The woman looking back was not the pale, frightened girl who had arrived on the train. Her face was brown. Her eyes held shadows. But she was solid. She was no longer a ghost. She thought of the town, the dusty street, the clanging of the railroad being built, the whispers, the fear. Then she thought of the high canyon, the smell of sage and wood smoke, the sound of the horses, the feel of Hawk's hand in hers. "It is a kind offer, Maggie," Hannah said, turning. "And I love you for it, but that is not my life, not anymore." Maggie sighed, but she was smiling. "I know, child. I just had to ask. He is a good man, that one, for a savage. He is a good man," Hannah agreed. No additions needed. When she returned to the camp the next morning, the people were already preparing to move. It was a somber, efficient process. Teepees were being dismantled, belongings packed. They were leaving the valley that had been their home for generations. Hawk was waiting for her. He was standing by his horse, but he was also holding the reins of a beautiful paint mare, a horse as graceful and strong as his own. He said nothing. He simply held out a bundle of folded, tanned hide. Hannah took it. She unfolded it. It was a dress, a woman's dress, made of the softest, whitest doe skin. It was exquisitely decorated with intricate quill work, tiny beads of blue and red, and fringe that hung like willow leaves. It was a work of art. She looked at him, confused. Atsa walked up, a rare smile on her face. "He is a warrior," Atsa said. "He does not have the soft words of the white man. A man of the people does not ask. He provides. He gives you a horse for your journey. He gives you a dress for your new life. He's asking you to share his lodge, his food, his winters, and his springs. He is asking you to be his wife." Hannah looked from the dress, to Atsa, to Hawk. He was watching her, his face unreadable, but she could see the tension in his uninjured shoulder. He was terrified. The great warrior, who had faced down soldiers, was afraid of her answer. She smiled, a real slow smile that started in her eyes. She did not say yes. She folded the dress, walked to her small pack, and took out the one thing she had saved, the white lace shawl. She walked back to him. "In my world," she said softly, "a bride wears white." She draped the lace shawl over the doeskin dress, a blending of two worlds. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "I will share your seasons." Hawk. The new land was exactly as promised. It was hard, dry, and wind-scoured. But it was theirs. They built their new camp in the shelter of a long mesa, near a creek that ran thin, but ran all year. They combined the old ways with the new. They planted the corn and beans and squash that Atsa had carefully saved. They herded the few cattle John Miller had owned, which Hawk had claimed as his own. Hannah's sewing skills became a currency. She sat in the shade, her fingers, now strong and calloused, flying. She mended shirts for the warriors. She taught the women how to cut and sew the calico fabric that Silas the trader now brought. She kept her small book of letters. In the evenings, she taught the Comanche children their English letters, scratching them in the dirt with a stick. Hawk traveled. He was the bridge. He traded their horses, which were the best on the plains, for flour, coffee, and steel tools. He was a leader not just in war, but in the difficult, grinding work of peace. He always left with the rising moon, and he always returned before it was full. Maggie sent packages with Silas, bolts of cloth, needles, a new book, and news. Major Cartwright had been found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and had been dishonorably discharged. Rumor had it he was now drunk in a St. Louis gutter. Kona, she wrote, had even come to town. He had not come to fight, but to trade. He had spent an hour watching the blacksmith, his angry eyes filled with a new, burning curiosity. One evening, as the sun set, painting the hard land in shades of soft purple and gold, Hannah sat outside their lodge. She was mending one of Hawk's shirts. A child ran past. Her own child, a little boy of 2 years. His hair the color of Hawk's, but his eyes the green of hers. He ran on sturdy legs, laughing, chasing a puppy. She heard a horse. She looked up. Hawk was riding in, silhouetted against the sky. He had been gone for a week. He dismounted, and their son ran to him. Shouting, Hawk swung the boy up onto his uninjured shoulder, his laughter a low, warm sound. He walked to Hannah and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of dust and coffee and the open plains. The trading was good, he said. The corn is high, she replied, leaning her head against his side. They stood together, a family, watching the sky fade. They were not hunted. They were not running. They were, at last, home. Several winters passed, carving new lines of wisdom onto the faces of the people and etching a kind of peace onto the hard, dry land. The camp, which had been a desperate refuge, grew into a home. It was no longer a cluster of temporary lodges, but a small, rooted village that hugged the base of the mesa. The land, which Lieutenant Davies had called land no white man wants, had proven him wrong. It simply required a different kind of listening. The Comanche, with Hannah's help, had coaxed life from the soil. Rows of corn, beans, and squash grew tall in the thin strip of fertile land by the creek. More than that, a small orchard of apple trees, grown from seedlings Silas had traded, had begun to blossom. They were small, gnarled trees, but the sight of their white and pink flowers against the red rock was a stubborn, beautiful promise. Hannah and Hawk's lodge was near the center of it all, and running between the corn rows. His laughter, a sound as bright as the creek water, was their son. He was a child of 2 worlds, named Toma, a blend of his father's language and his mother's lost brother. He had Hawk's black eyes and straight hair, but in the sun, that hair shone with a faint brown, a hint of his mother's lighter color. He ran with the other children, a small, sturdy bridge of flesh and blood. The community itself had changed. It was a place of hybrids. The children, Tama among them, shouted at each other in a mixture of Comanche and English. Hannah, in the long winter evenings, held a school in her lodge, teaching not just her son but a dozen others how to read the strange symbols in her books. In return, the children taught her the true names of the stars. Dusty Creek was still there, but the line of fear between the town and the camp had thinned. At the last autumn harvest festival, a celebration of their survival, a few white faces had appeared. Maggie had come, her saloon now a respectable hotel, and she had brought bolts of bright calico. Silas the trader was there, of course, and even Reverend Brown had come, not to preach, but to sit and share a bowl of stew, his eyes wide with a quiet, surprised respect. Atsa, her hair now the color of snow, sat wrapped in a thick blanket, watching it all. She watched a young Comanche warrior showing a white ranch hand how to fletch an arrow. She watched Hannah laughing with Maggie. She smoked her pipe and nodded, a deep contentment in her old eyes. This is what I thought the spirits had forgotten, she said to no one, and everyone. This is a day I did not think to see. Hawk had changed, too. The wound in his shoulder had healed into a puckered silver scar, a constant reminder of the price of peace. He was still a warrior, still the leader of the hunters, but his purpose was different. The great herds of buffalo were gone, ghosts on the prairie. Hawk now led small, precise hunts, taking only what was needed, teaching the younger men to honor the few that remained. His greater role, however, was as a negotiator. When new white settlers, drawn by the rumor of the railroad, pushed too close to their borders, it was Hawk who rode out. He did not ride with a nocked arrow. He rode with a copy of the treaty, and with a quiet authority that was more powerful than any weapon. He was no longer just a fighter. He was a protector of the delicate balance they had built. And Hannah. She was no longer the mail-order bride. She was not Hannah Reed of Boston. She was not a victim, not a stray. She was the heart of the lodge, the woman who speaks two ways. Her hands were never still. She helped the women tan the hides, but she also taught them to use the patterns from her books. She created clothing that was a beautiful, practical fusion warm wool shirts edged with intricate Comanche beadwork, buckskin dresses cut with the lines of a Boston skirt. One afternoon, a new figure appeared on the ridge. It was a girl, perhaps 16, on a sway-backed, exhausted horse. She was mixed blood, like Tama, but her life had clearly held none of his joy. She had run from Dusty Creek, where she was spat on by the white patrons of the saloon she scrubbed, and mocked by the pure Comanche who traded there. She was an outcast from both, belonging to neither. She slid off her horse, shaking, her eyes wide with the fear of a hunted animal. She had heard there was a place where she might be safe. Hannah saw her. She saw the girl's terror, her shame, her utter loneliness. She saw herself, standing on the train platform, with nothing but a one-way ticket to a dead end. Hannah walked to the girl, whose hand was resting on a knife at her belt. The girl flinched, expecting a blow or an insult. Hannah stopped in front of her. She did not offer pity. She did not offer charity. She simply looked at the girl, seeing all the broken pieces, and she held out her hand, palm up. The girl stared at the hand, confused. "You do not belong in their cage," Hannah said, her voice soft, but with the strength of the mesa behind her. "You have a home." She took the girl's trembling hand on her own. "Welcome home." That evening, Hannah understood. The world was still a dark and violent place. Silas brought news from the east, of new laws, of other tribes being broken, of children being stolen and sent to schools to have their language beaten out of them. The great grinding machine of progress was still turning. She knew she and Hawk had not saved the world. They had not stopped the injustice or the greed. But she looked at the young girl, sleeping by the fire, the first peaceful sleep of her life. She looked at her son, already dreaming. They had not saved the world, but they had built one. They had taken a small, hard piece of land and made it a place of justice, a place where the broken could be mended, a place where a person's worth was not measured by the color of their skin, but by the strength of their heart. That was not the act of a victim. It was the act of a creator. A few days later, Hannah walked to the top of the small hill that overlooked their valley. She often came here in the evenings. From here, if she looked east, she could almost imagine the distant gray ocean of her childhood. Boston, a place that was no longer a home, not even a memory, just a story she told her son. She heard the sound of a horse and the running footsteps of a small boy. She turned. Hawk was riding in from the prairie, his hunt successful. Tama ran to him, and Hawk swung him up into the saddle, the boy's laughter echoing in the clear air. Hawk rode the horse to the top of the hill and dismounted, leaving Tama to sit proudly on the great war pony. He walked to Hannah, his boots silent on the earth. He stood beside her, following her gaze to the east. Thinking of the other world, he asked quietly, "It is not my world," Hannah said. "Not anymore." He smiled, a slow, warm smile that still, after all these years, made her heart beat a little faster. He took her hand, which had been pale and soft, was now brown and calloused, a map of the life she had built. His hand was just as scarred, their fingers interlaced, fitting together perfectly. "I told you once," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Welcome home." He turned her hand over, his thumb brushing her palm. "It is still true." Hannah smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Yes," she said, "it is still true." They stood there for a long time, the man, the woman, and the child, watching the sun set over their valley. That night, they sat outside their lodge. The fire snapped, sending sparks up toward a river of stars that stretched to infinity. Tama was asleep in Hannah's lap, his small hand resting on her chest, in the vast, vast distance. So faint it was almost a ghost. They heard it, the whistle of a train. Miles and miles away. The sound of the iron road, the sound of the world that was rushing to swallow the prairie whole. It was a lonely, hungry sound. But here, in their valley, other sounds were stronger. The sound of the wind moving through the corn, the sound of the horses stamping softly in the dark, and from the center of the camp, the low, steady heartbeat of a drum. A song of thanks, a song of endurance. Hannah looked down at her sleeping son. She laid her hand on the cool, hard-packed earth, feeling the thrum of the land itself. Hawk, sitting beside her, covered her hand with his own. His warmth sank into her. Their son stirred in his sleep, his small hand falling from her chest to rest on top of theirs. 3 hands, a bridge, rooted to the earth, love. Hannah knew, did not erase injustice. It did not stop the storms, or heal all the wounds. But it gave you a reason to stand. It gave you the strength to build a shelter. And freedom. She finally understood. Was not the absence of rules. It was the right to live a life that did not betray your own soul. In the heart of the wild, untamed West, in the face of all the blood and all the sorrow, they had found theirs. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm so curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts and share this experience together. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and if this story touched you, give this video a like and press that hype button. It truly helps get these stories heard by so many more.